This is Fortifying ICS OT, Defensible architecture. If that is not what you thought you were seeing, then you might be on the wrong track. Yep, I know, I'm sorry. So my name's Harry Thomas. I am the CTO and co-founder of a company called Freynos. I've been in cybersecurity for a little bit over a decade now. Funny enough, before I got into cybersecurity, I was a nurse. We can talk about that transition later. I've worked at some of the most known OT cybersecurity companies out there. Security Matters before they sold to Forescout. I was a dev and a solution architect there. I also led research and development at Dragos from Series B to Series D. And then I led an AI ML team at AWS Security, build user behavioral analytics to detect if threats were trying to impersonate employees. So a lot of fun there. But let's talk about trying to fortify your OT environment and such. Building a defensible architecture, what is that? But let's talk about how we got here. This is all stuff you know. Complex OT environments. Sometimes they're heterogeneous, sometimes they're not, right? Maybe you acquired an oil refinery or something like that, and initially you guys were a Clarity shop. Now you're a Clarity and a Zomi shop, or a Clarity and Drago shop. Got you, John. Just things aren't the same. And then why defensible architecture matters. So defensible architecture, building a defensible architecture is actually number 2 SANS ICS critical control. So this is something that we all have to work towards. Fortunately and unfortunately within SANS, they have loosely defined what that is. And I'm here to try to add a little bit more light to that from my opinion at Freynos. Just the overall goal is to ensure resiliency. So whatever happens, it's always best to deter threats than stop threats altogether. If you work towards a mentality of always stopping threats, then you're never gonna really achieve that goal. For me, it's always to deter, slow them down, and then respond. So this is the eyesore slide. I'm sorry for the people in the back, but let me go through it. So we need to transition from reactive to proactive cybersecurity. Now, what do I talk about reactive cybersecurity? Reactive cybersecurity is actually what we're traditionally doing now. Not just in ICS OT, but also in IT networks, right? That reactive approach going, hey, I'm gonna sit here, deploy a network security monitoring sensor, and when I detect a bad guy, then I'm gonna respond. Or I'm gonna wait until a phishing email gets through my email filter and have DLP or something like that to stop that code from executing. That's all very reactive. And unfortunately, the more reactive you are, the more dwell time an adversary has within your environment. So if we can transition to being proactive, proactively identify our security gaps, proactively patch, or not just patch, but segment and such, then the dwell time for the adversary becomes a lot less. Does that make sense? I see some heads nodding. All right. So these are the core principles of the definition of defensible architecture. I don't know if it matches with SANS entirely, but obviously you want resilience, you want to respond, you want to detect, and you want to prevent. Prevention can be a lot of things. It could be firewalls, endpoint monitoring, depending on what systems you can deploy that on. Detection's really easy, detecting threats either within the network or on the endpoint themselves. Response also, forward, being able to respond to when that threat comes or happens, quarantine, contain, and then eradicate. And then resilience, utmost, within OT environments is uptime. So ensuring that we're resilient. Can we take an attack? Think about something physical, like MMA fighters or something like that, right? They work on resiliency. Can they take a punch? Think about that for your environment. Can your environment take a punch? Can it take an adversary coming in, doing something bad, and are you able to come back up in a shorter amount of time, RTO and such? These are some other characteristics of defensibility architecture. We already touched about resiliency. Adaptability and scalability are also things that I think are key and needs to be worked on. So scalability, whatever you deploy out there, you got to make sure it works for your smallest plants, your smallest substation, to large generation and such, right? Whatever processes you're enacting or technologies you're implementing or building yourself, right? That's what you need to think about. And then adaptability. Can your defenses adapt to ever-evolving, ever-growing threats? If there's a new technique that comes out tomorrow, but they still rely on the same old lateral movement techniques like RDP and such, or credential gathering, right? Are you able to adapt to the initial access, which might be that 0 day, but still be able to contain and do what you need to do to slow down or deter the threat? Now, I'm going to preface that the first half of this presentation is a little bit theoretical, right? But afterwards, I'm going to actually provide you what you guys can do and how you can implement this. So this is something that I came up with, the 5 T's of the threat strategic framework. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it goes from threat modeling to threat profiling, assessment, testing, and analysis. You're looking at this and you're like, Harry, this is very much like just a tabletop exercise. It is, but there's a twist to it, right? We're doing this proactively. We're trying to understand what we can implement proactively, right? There's a mentality shift because generally tabletop exercises are how can you respond? Well, let's shift this left of boom. What can we do so we don't have to respond in that type of manner? Threat modeling is very simple. Determining what you're trying to defend against. Identify that target. Is it ransomware? Is it nation state? Whatever. Threat profiling is understanding the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. Now, if you're not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures, it's pretty simple, pretty easy. They list them all out, what hackers can do. It's not all-encompassing, but for the majority of what adversaries out there, it's pretty encompassing. All those common techniques that you would use to exploit or laterally move and such. The assessment is where it gets tricky, right? So the assessment, you can do a multitude of things, and we'll talk about that, paper-based assessment, like traditional tabletops, penetration testing, which doesn't really fly in OT environments. And then there's something else called simulations, of which we're going to talk about too. Same thing with testing, and then analysis, that post-mortem. We're familiar with postmortems after tabletop exercises. You want to do the same thing, and this is where you kind of build that cycle, and you go through and through as a circle to continually do this, right? So this is kind of a flavor of threat hunting before the fact, tabletops exercises before the fact, stuff that's going to influence a lot of that. So we're going to actually have a use case of Volt Typhoon. We're going to examine what they did, and we're going to play this 5 T's on our own environment. It's all fictitious, except for Volt Typhoon. It's very much real. Nation state sponsored cyber campaign, targeted US critical infrastructure, a lot of living off the land techniques. That's what all adversaries have to do. I used to be a hacker and malware developer. That is always living off the land. That's the quickest way to get detected, is not doing what looks normal. Their focus mainly is on stealth and long-term persistence. That's key when trying to understand how to enact the 5 T's. You want to know what the adversary's goals are. If it's long-term persistent, be sneaky, they're going to be quiet. If it cause as much mayhem as possible, they're just going to come in and spam whatever exploits across your network, maybe try to worm and such. They also were doing intelligence gathering. That's also another thing, crown jewel analysis. What are your crown jewels? It's not just the physical processes that you're trying to protect. Maybe there's intellectual property. Maybe there's data about customer information or client information that you want to protect. And then they want to expose the ICS OT vulnerable environments. So threat modeling, we already talked about a little bit of that on that last slide. But Volt Typhoon, China, their goals is it was pre-positioning, persistence as well, a little bit of espionage as a fancy word. and then very much electric utility focused. And then from a technique perspective, there's actually quite a few techniques that they utilize, but we're just going to use a subsection of that. And then obviously credential access, because once you get in, credentials kind of gives you the keys to the kingdom most of the time. Now the threat profiling itself is understanding those TTPs. We only took a subsection of them. Right? From initial access, which is exploit publicly facing applications. So think about Palo Alto, Global Protect, and such, which is readily out there, maybe trying to find a way in. Credential access, gathering valid credentials, ensuring that you can stay persistent, maybe put some sort of rootkit or persistence that you can put on an endpoint so you can keep and establish your foothold. A lot of living off the land techniques, SMB, for lateral movement, or maybe execute WMI, command scripting, amongst other things. And then persistent application layer protocols, what you need to do in order to get some sort of backhaul channel, phone home, to ensure that you're still staying there. Now, the threat assessment itself is breaking down, here, let me step down, so you guys don't continue turning your heads. So it's breaking down your vulnerable systems, your network weaknesses, and your critical assets. That's what those three circles are. And really trying to understand as a whole what in your environment gets put in those buckets, right? Do you have network weaknesses that you want to focus on? Maybe it's Fortinet firewalls or RDPs allowed, stuff like that. Really analyzing your firewall policies. Your vulnerable systems running Windows 7, Windows 8, maybe an outdated EXXI hypervisor. And then critical assets where Schweitzer, IEDs, RTX, and possibly like Active Directory. Now let's talk about threat testing and the importance of it. There's different ways to do it. I already mentioned paper-based. We can sit here and all gather around in a circle and chit-chat about what we think hypothetically might happen. Another way is live scenario testing, penetration testing, right? Let's release some hackers into an environment and see what they can do. Good, but that probably won't fly in your OT environments just because you don't want them to shut anything down. And sometimes if you do perform a penetration test, it's very much scoped down to a lab that you think mimics your environment, or scoped to a pre-deployment of a substation or something like that for FAT-SAT testing, right? But nothing really on live systems. There's a saying that I like to have, and a credit to an old buddy of mine, Austin Scott, from Dragos. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary firewall rule, and we're changing firewall rules daily. The last way is simulated impact on your critical assets. Think consequence-driven scenarios, right? What is that consequence? What is it going to look like? And what does a person that has the means and motivation, what can they do to get there? And actually go and gather the artifacts and resources themselves to verify that this can be done. And that's where a lot of tabletops actually fall short. Paper-based scenario is that you're not actually going out and gathering and looking at, what accounts are on in your Active Directory. What are the privileges? Have you ran Bloodhound lately? Right? So for like vulnerable systems, maybe you have a Windows system. Have you tried invoking Mimikatz on there? See if you can extract those credentials, right? That's a valid way for an adversary to extract creds from a Windows box, is Mimikatz. Or try to get to your hypervisor, right? And see if it allows anonymous access or has weak cryptographic, or it also has maybe information disclosure, right? Not necessarily penetration testing, but performing an individual assessment on what an overarching attack path might look like. Now let's test network weaknesses. There's Nmap up there. You're not going to Nmap scan your network. It's just not going to happen. But you can go and look at your firewall policies, your firewall rules. There's a lot of tools out there. You can probably download like Tufin for free or something like that, just to analyze your firewall rules, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and figure out what's the most valid way an adversary might try to take advantage of what's readily allowed in your environment. Now, there's a little anecdote to this. Palo Alto, and I'm sure Fortinet and all them other firewalls have it, they have something called application default. Now, we're all aware of an any rule, right? Allow anything through. Well, there's also a rule called application default, meaning as long as the protocol you're using is using what the application default ports are, it is allowed through the firewall. And unfortunately, most of us rely on application default as a layer of protection. Theoretically, it's an any rule. It just binds the user or the hacker to use what valid ports are for that particular protocol. Great for your network security monitoring, bad for your firewall prevention. And then analyzing your critical assets, right? Remember, these are different portions of an overarching attack path, attack steps. So you want to go to your Schweitzer IEDs and R attacks, see what's available, what that information looks like. Maybe take a look on their vulnerabilities they have out there and see which ones are applicable and which ones that, based off of your analysis of your network, might be allowed through to these devices to perform any such harm. And then afterwards, after you get done all this, you compile what the attack path is, and I know it's hard to see up there. You want to do your postmortem or your threat analysis, right? And part of this Volt Typhoon, after we went through everything, would have been we needed to identify our choke points. Within every network, there are choke points that an adversary must go through in order to advance their lateral movement or pivot throughout your network. Focus on those choke points. It's great to have network security monitoring in your substations or near your safety control systems. But when an adversary is there already and they hit that red button to do whatever they need to do, you're just identifying who did it or what did it. You're not trying to deter them. You're not trying to stop them. So focusing on choke points themselves is a way to deter and stop threats more upstream to your crown jewels. Next is enhancing defenses in key locations. Those would be your choke points as well. Focusing on your critical assets, right? We identified possible maybe vulnerabilities of our critical assets that were like, well, this could be utilized based off of the firewall configuration policy and such. Maybe we need to think about patching that or implementing some additional microsegmentation so that doesn't get used. And also part of your threat analysis would be creating some sort of graph like this and understanding where your choke points are. So the green right there is a billing application system. That's a choke point. And the red is the DMZ. Your DMZ will almost always be the choke point. But it's the green that matters. You didn't know that billing application system had direct access to substations, right? So maybe you need to bolster your security around there because we know that DMZ is generally, pretty secure for the most part. And then you want to prioritize your actionable measures using crawl, walk, run. Always crawl, walk, run. Don't do it in terms of priorities. This is a high critical priority because priorities change. So let's talk about how you guys can do this by yourselves, right? Yes?
I have a quick question about your network graph. Was that constructed from firewall rules or layer 2 information or what? Or data flows?
That was constructed with PowerPoint.
What's the source data for?
There's no source data, it's just fictitious.
But if you were doing it?
If I were doing it, yeah, so that's, you're actually dovetailing and writing exactly what we're doing. To do that would be actually thinking about the art of the possible. You want to leverage a simulation environment. This right here is just Python pseudocode for parsing firewall configuration files, adding it to a graph database, and being able to understand where your interconnectivity is. So let's talk about how to implement this yourself. First, you need a graph database. You need to identify which one you want to use. I put 2 up there. I'm partial to 1. Neo4j, great, I love it. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of resources to run sometimes, specifically the graph algorithms. One is a RangoDB. That is what I'm partial to. It's a multimodal database that does both NoSQL and graph, which is great when you want to store additional information surrounding a project or surrounding an attack path that you don't need to keep in a separate, SharePoint drive. So you want to identify your graph database. Next, you want to model what it looks like. Model what your network would look like. So up there, and this is what I like to use, is devices are attached to networks, networks are attached to networks. Because if a network can talk to another network within a firewall policy, then the given devices generally within that network can talk to the other network. So if you do this, what's happening is you're reducing a lot of that compute time for your algorithms in order to identify things like shortest path. And that's pseudocode for parsing the firewall rules. You have your sources, your destinations. We all have different firewalls, and I feel bad for some of you all out there that have like 3 or 4 different vendors. It would be a lot, but this is how you do it. Next, you want to identify your choke points once it's inside the graph database, right? We already built our data model. We know what that looks like. Now we can use graph algorithms readily available in these DBs to identify our choke points. One is betweenness centrality. That is one algorithm. That is almost the definition of the choke point, where everything is flowing through that one node. And if you're not familiar with graph databases, nodes and edges. Nodes are the circles and the edges are the links together. Next is PageRank, where you give a certain value or importance. It actually tries to understand the importance of a certain node within a graph. So not only might it identify the choke point, but it might identify choke points closer to more critical crown jewels and critical systems, really allowing you to move your defenses more upstream. And then the last algorithm that I like to use is shortest path. What is the shortest path between a source and a destination? Or give me all the shortest paths between a source and a destination. And if you can visualize that, you can identify quickly with a glance what that choke point might look like. And then this is the overall visualization of the attack path. Now remember, networks can talk to other networks. Same thing with these links, right? Hackers, they don't just go forward. Sometimes they have to double back. So when you're looking and visualizing your network, know that if there's a link somewhere between these, cross networks, A, D, B, and C, that means they can talk to each other. It's just going to have to take a longer route, longer TTL to get around. And then your analysis as well. So really adding in your crown jewel information, adding in all that other auxiliary information necessary in order to go, yes, looking at this graph, I understand what it means, I understand my choke points, I understand where I need to bolster my defenses. And that is it. I believe I only had 45 minutes. I tried to go through that as quick as possible. There was a lot of slides. Do we have questions? Don't be shy. He already asked one. John, I'm looking at you.
So when you're modeling networks, are they layer 3? Are those cyber blocks that you're using for your networks?
Yeah. So the question, there's actually a microphone there too. So I want to stand up so I don't have to repeat the question. So the question was, when you're modeling the networks, are you using layer 3? Generally, yes. Yeah. So the reason why I like to parse firewall configuration files rather than utilize like network security monitoring as a source of truth is partially due to the fact that firewall rules don't lie. Even if you don't have a network actually utilizing that IP space still exists within your network. It's still routable in some aspect or way. Cool. Sir in the green, you had a question? Yes, so the plan is to publish the slides. I have one more talk at the end of next month, but we'll be publishing the slides at Franos themselves, and I believe maybe HUSECon, did you guys record this and such? They recorded it, so it will be available there as well. Anything else? Questions, concerns, aspirations? Yes, sir, in the back.
In our OT environments, we have a lot of other networks besides IP-based, right? We've got PLT, we've got serial, RS-45. How would you document that type of communication?
So those communications, the questions about like serial-based communication pathways and other things that aren't IP routable networks. So the way I would do that actually is generally you have maybe, I'm hoping you have maybe an IP to serial translator out there. Yes? No? Not always?
So a lot of times, third-party connections, that's usually a lot less serial communication.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so I would model it the same way. Maybe you could add, the nodes themselves have different properties that you can add values to. So you can create a property saying this is a serial-based connection. Additionally, when you're utilizing those algorithms, some of the algorithms like K-path and such, you can add weights to your edges, like a value. And maybe for you guys, the higher the value, the harder it is to communicate with that device, or the lesser the value or something along the lines of that. You can model it that way. And I thought I saw one other hand. Over here, no? Yes, sir.
All right. So the graphs you built, it looks like you did a lot of scripting to get to them, and you use like third-party tools to put them together. I've seen other products where you can map the network, right, and find misconfigurations and things like that. If I were trying to do this back at my workplace, like I would need an additional resource to actually be doing this stuff, right? So I'm just wondering, it looks like you like to do it hands-on, right, and spend time on it, but right now I don't have anyone to be able to do this.
Okay, so your question is
What else is out
what
there?
else is out there from a commercial aspect or from like an open source tool aspect?
I would say
Commercial? Well, we at Franos do something akin to this, so that we can talk after this if that's something you want to discuss. There are other, you can kind of fudge it a little bit with maybe 2 or 3 commercial tools that do portions of what you're looking for and then just aggregate it into a single database. Most of you guys are probably already working with 1 or 2 of those tools initially, so it would be a third one. I know that the business case to acquire more software probably isn't there, but there are some open source projects out there that can help you out with this too.
For example, we use NetBrain
NetBrain.
and a combination of other tools, but to do the initial mapping, NetBrain is great.
Yeah.
But you don't get all the information. It just maps it for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It tell you what's talking to what.
Yeah.
You have to throw in like NetFlow or other tools, right?
Right.
But again, it's a little easier once you get them all deployed to each network node.
Right.
Right. That's kind of where I was trying to compare to what I have to see.
Well, we can talk offline after this and we can discuss what you have, personally, and then we can figure out maybe there's a stopgap or something like that you can implement. All right, awesome. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? Sold to the highest bidder. All right, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. That's my email up there. Reach out. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I answer most of those messages. Probably not timely, but I'll answer them.